A man the size of a freight train lunged at the city's most feared crime boss, a rusted steel pipe gripped in his massive hands. Bullets weren't fast enough. Bodyguards were dead weight. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, a 22-year-old waitress making minimum wage running on 3 hours of sleep, stale coffee, and pure, unfiltered panic did what a rival syndicate couldn't. She took the giant down in 3 seconds flat. And she didn't even mean to. The grease in the air at Lombardi's didn't just sit on your skin. It moved in. It found the pores on the back of your neck, settled into the cheap polyester of the uniform, and made a permanent home in the rubber treads of Sadie's non-slip shoes. It was a Tuesday night. It was raining. The kind of cold, spiteful rain that made the city smell like wet exhaust and rotting cardboard. Sadie leaned against the stainless steel prep counter in the kitchen, pressing the heel of her hand into her right temple. Her feet throbbed. A low, rhythmic ache pulsed from her arches, straight up her calves, the result of a double shift she hadn't wanted, but desperately needed. Rent was due in 4 days. The math in her head was a constant, exhausting ticker tape. $50 tonight means I can cover electricity, but I still need another $80 for groceries. If I skip lunch tomorrow... Sadie, table 4, now. Carl, the floor manager, snapped his fingers in front of her face. His forehead was slick with a thin layer of sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of the ovens. Carl was a man who lived in a perpetual state of nervous digestion, but tonight his anxiety was radiating off him in waves. "I'm on it, Carl," Sadie muttered, pushing off the counter. She grabbed the heavy black tray. "Don't just be on it!" Carl hissed his voice, dropping to a frantic whisper. He grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Look at me." "Do you know who is at table 4? Sadie sighed, pulling her arm away. She grabbed a damp rag and wiped down the edges of the tray. "A party of 5. 3 steaks, 1 veal, 1 branzino. Sparkling water. No ice. It's Dominic Russo." Carl breathed the name like it was a bomb about to go off. Sadie paused. She wasn't an idiot. You didn't live in this city, breathe this air, and not know who Dominic Russo was. He wasn't the kind of mobster who made headlines with flashy cars or club shootouts. He was the kind who owned the concrete the clubs were built on. He operated in the quiet, brutal spaces between legitimate business and violent extortion. "Okay," Sadie said. Her voice was flat. She didn't have the energy to be terrified. Terror burned calories. "Does he want his steak medium rare or not? Just don't spill anything. Don't look him in the eye too long. Pour the water, serve the plates from the left, and get out of there." Carl wiped his forehead with a napkin. "His guys are on edge. I can feel it." Sadie picked up the tray. It was heavy. 3 thick cuts of prime rib, a whole fishbone in veal, cast-iron side dishes of garlic potatoes, and plates of broccolini. The weight settled onto her forearm, a familiar bruising pressure. She pushed through the swinging double doors into the dining room. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. Lombardi's was usually a noisy place, filled with the clatter of silverware and the loud, boastful chatter of local businessmen. Tonight the noise was muffled. The other patrons were leaning in over their tables, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes constantly darting toward the back corner booth. Table 4. There were 4 men in the booth. 3 of them were built like cinder blocks, broad shoulders, stretching the seams of expensive wool suits, eyes scanning the room with the mechanical sweeping motion of security cameras. Then there was Dominic Russo. He didn't look like a monster. He looked exhausted. He wore a charcoal suit that draped perfectly across his frame, but his tie was loosened, and the top button of his shirt was undone. He was staring down at the pristine white tablecloth, tracing the edge of a water glass with a thick, calloused finger. There were dark circles under his eyes. He smelled strongly of black coffee, expensive vetiver cologne, and the sharp metallic tang of cold rain. Sadie approached the table. She kept her eyes on the plates. She wasn't trying to be deferential. She just didn't want to drop the branzino. Prime rib, medium rare. She said, her voice tight, mechanical. She slid the heavy porcelain plate in front of one of the bodyguards. He didn't look at her. He just grunted. Veal. She placed it down. She moved to Dominic. Bone-in ribeye, rare. As she leaned over to place the plate, the heavy cast-iron skillet of garlic potatoes on her tray shifted. The grease on the bottom of the skillet met the smooth plastic of the tray. It slid. Sadie's heart seized. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline spiked through her chest. She violently jerked her left arm up, catching the edge of the sizzling skillet with her bare fingers just before it tipped off the edge. The heat blistered her skin instantly. A sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her teeth, but she clamped her jaw shut, shoving the skillet back into place. Her hand trembled. She quickly set the rest of the plates down her fingertips, burning with a bright, hot agony. Dominic Russo stopped tracing his glass. He looked up. His eyes were a flat, muddy brown. There was no warmth in them, but there wasn't cruelty either. Just a heavy, suffocating emptiness. He looked at her hand, where the skin was already turning a violent shade of red. Then he looked at her face. Sadie swallowed hard, hiding her hand behind her back. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "Ice," Dominic said. His voice was gravel quiet, but carrying a strange acoustic weight in the hushed room. "For the water, for your hand." Sadie blinked. She didn't know how to respond to that. She just nodded once tightly and backed away from the table. "Enjoy your meal." She retreated to the kitchen, the swinging doors flapping shut behind her. As soon as she was out of sight, she rushed to the prep sink and shoved her hand under the cold tap. The frigid water hit the burn, and she squeezed her eyes shut, letting out a long, shaky breath. "Everything okay out there?" Hector the line cook asked, not looking up from the grill. "Fine," Sadie lied, wrapping a rough paper towel around her stinging fingers. "Just fine. 2 hours left. Just 2 hours." She had no idea that the night hadn't even started. The lull in a restaurant is a physical thing. It happens around 9:45 p.m. The dinner rush is over. The heavy eaters are digesting, lingering over half-empty glasses of Merlot and plates smeared with cold sauce. The kitchen stops shouting. The clatter of pans fades into the steady hum of the industrial dishwashing machine. Sadie was wiping down the wait station near the front entrance, a damp, bleach-soaked rag in her good hand. Her burned hand throbbed wrapped in a napkin, secured with a rubber band. The smell of bleach and old espresso grounds filled her nose. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour. The streetlights bled across the wet pavement in long, blurry streaks of yellow and red. She looked up at the front door. Lombardi's had heavy double doors made of dark oak and frosted glass. They kept the cold out. They kept the city out, until they didn't. The doors didn't just open, they were shoved inward with a force that made the brass hinges scream. The cold air hit Sadie first. It rushed into the warm, garlic-scented dining room like a ghost carrying the smell of wet asphalt and something else. Something sour, like unwashed clothes and rusted iron. A man stepped into the foyer. He was too big. That was the first thought that registered in Sadie's tired brain. Human beings weren't supposed to be shaped like that. He stood at least 7 feet tall, his shoulders so wide he had to turn slightly sideways to clear the heavy doorframe. He was wearing a dark green military surplus trench coat that was soaked through dripping black water onto the polished hardwood floor. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a fraction of a second, his heavy, mud-caked boots sinking into the entrance mat. His face was a slab of meat, scarred and weather-beaten, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a sodden wool cap. The silence in the restaurant deepened. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a lull anymore. It was the hard, vacuumed silence of a room holding its breath. At table 4, the atmosphere snapped. Dominic's lead bodyguard, a man named Paulie, was in the middle of taking a bite of potato. He froze. His eyes locked onto the giant in the doorway. Paulie's hand dropped the fork. It clattered loudly against the porcelain. He reached inside his suit jacket. He was too slow. The giant reached into the deep pocket of his trench coat. There was no smooth, practiced draw. It was jerky, brutal. He pulled out a heavy matte black pistol with a long, thick suppressor threaded onto the barrel. Pff, thwack. It didn't sound like a gunshot in a movie. It sounded like an industrial staple gun misfiring. Paulie didn't scream. His head snapped back as if he'd been punched by an invisible fist. A fine red mist sprayed across the white tablecloth and the half-eaten prime rib. He slumped forward, his face landing dead center in his plate, knocking his water glass over. Ice cubes and bloody water spilled across the table. Chaos didn't erupt immediately. There was a full 2-second delay where the brain simply refused to process what the eyes were seeing. Then a woman at the next table started screaming. A high, reedy, endless sound. The other 2 bodyguards at Dominic's table surged upward, chairs kicking back, hands clawing for their holsters. Pff, thwack. Pff, thwack! The giant fired twice more. One guard went down hard, clutching his collarbone, blood leaking rapidly through his fingers. The other fired blindly, a deafening crack that shattered the ambient noise of the restaurant. The bullet missed the giant, completely shattering a mirror behind the bar. Glass rained down like hail, clinking against the liquor bottles. Sadie stood frozen at the wait station. She was 10 feet away from the giant. She couldn't move. Her feet felt like they were set in concrete. Her heart was beating so fast, it felt like a continuous, painful vibration in her chest. She wasn't breathing. The giant didn't even look at her. She was a fixture. Furniture. He dropped the suppressed pistol. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. It was out of bullets or jammed, or he just didn't care anymore. From inside the folds of his wet coat, he drew something else. A rusted, heavy steel pipe. It was 3 feet long, thick as a wrist with a jagged fitting on one end. He locked eyes with Dominic Russo. Dominic hadn't run. He hadn't ducked under the table. He had pushed himself back into the corner of the booth, his own weapon drawn, a compact silver revolver. He fired. The bullet caught the giant in the shoulder. The heavy wool coat jerked a puff of fabric, and blood exploding outward. The giant didn't even flinch. He let out a low, wet growl, a sound that vibrated in Sadie's teeth and charged. He was a freight train made of meat and wet wool. His massive boots slammed against the hardwood, closing the distance to table 4 with terrifying speed. He was going to crush Dominic's skull. It was a mathematical certainty. The mass, the speed, the heavy steel pipe there was no stopping it. Sadie was still standing at the wait station. Her hands were clutching the edge of the counter. Next to her was a towering, industrial stainless steel coffee urn. She had just filled it with 3 gallons of boiling water to steep the loose-leaf chamomile tea for a large party in the back room. The metal of the urn was radiating a vicious heat. The giant was running right past her. He was an arm's length away. Sadie didn't make a heroic choice. She didn't have a flashback to a self-defense class. She didn't think about saving a mob boss. She didn't think at all. Her brain simply short-circuited into pure, animal panic. She needed to get away. She needed a barrier. She needed to put something between herself and the massive, violent thing rushing past her. She turned her burned hand, screaming in protest, and grabbed the heavy black plastic handles of the boiling coffee urn. The urn weighed close to 30 pounds. Filled to the brim with scalding water, it was a clumsy, sloshing cylinder of heat. As the giant barreled past the wait station, his heavy shoulder clipped Sadie's arm. The force of it spun her around, throwing her off balance. Her cheap rubber-soled shoes slid on a spot of grease she had meant to mop up earlier. She was falling backward. The urn was tipping toward her face. Survival instinct, harsh and absolute, took the wheel. Sadie didn't want the boiling water on her face. With a desperate, violent shove, she pushed the heavy metal urn away from her body as she went down. She hurled it directly into the path of the charging giant. The timing was an accident of physics. The lid of the urn popped off. 3 gallons of 210-degree water erupted outward in a steaming, arcing wave. It didn't hit the giant in the face. It hit him right at the waistline, soaking through his trousers and completely drenching his thighs, knees, and heavy boots. But it wasn't just the heat. It was the hardware. The heavy, empty stainless steel cylinder, still carrying the momentum of Sadie's desperate shove, slammed directly into the side of the giant's left kneecap. Crack. It was a wet, hollow sound, louder than the screaming in the dining room. The giant let out a roar, not a battle cry, but a sudden, shocking bellow of absolute agony. His left leg buckled inward at an unnatural angle, but he was running too fast. His momentum carried him forward. His heavy, mud-slicked boot planted onto the hardwood floor, right where the boiling water had pooled. He had no traction. His shattered knee couldn't support the weight. The 7-foot, 300-pound assassin went airborne. His feet flew out from under him. For a fraction of a second, he was entirely horizontal, suspended in the air above the polished floor, the rusted steel pipe flying from his grip. Gravity reclaimed him violently. He didn't just fall. He launched himself face first toward the corner of the heavy marble-topped hostess stand. The impact was sickening. It wasn't a thump. It was a hard, definitive crunch of bone meeting stone. The giant's body hit the floor a split second later, sliding across the wet hardwood like a rag doll. He crashed into the base of the bar, taking down a row of wooden bar stools in a tangle of limbs and green wool, and then he didn't move. The steel pipe clattered across the floor, spinning slowly before coming to a stop against the toe of Sadie's black work shoe. Sadie was sitting on the floor, her back against the wait-station cabinet. Her breathing was ragged, sucking in air in sharp, desperate gasps. Her right hand, the burned one, was shaking uncontrollably. Her uniform was soaked with spilled water, sticking to her skin. Her elbow throbbed where she had hit the ground. The restaurant was completely silent again. The screaming had stopped. The patrons were cowering under their tables. The remaining conscious bodyguard was staring at the crumpled mass of the giant. His gun still raised his mouth, hanging slightly open. A puddle of dark, thick blood was beginning to pool out from underneath the giant's head, mixing with the spilled, boiling water on the floorboards. It smelled like raw copper and chamomile. Sadie stared at the giant. She stared at his hand, which was the size of a dinner plate, lying limp against the wood. "I killed him," her brain whispered. "I tripped him, and I killed him." A wave of intense nausea hit her. Her stomach cramped violently. She scrambled onto her hands and knees, crawling behind the wait station, and threw up dryly into the small plastic trash can used for discarded receipt paper. She choked, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling arm, the taste of bile burning her throat. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, leather soles crunching on broken glass. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest. She expected a gun to be pressed to her temple. She expected shouting. She expected a bullet. The footsteps stopped right in front of her. She slowly raised her head. Dominic Russo was standing there. He looked exactly as he had 10 minutes ago, except his tie was completely undone now, and there was a fine speckling of someone else's blood on his white shirt collar. His silver revolver hung loosely in his right hand, pointed at the floor. He wasn't looking at the dead giant. He wasn't looking at his bleeding bodyguard. He was looking down at Sadie. His flat, muddy brown eyes scoured her face. He took in her soaked uniform, her trembling frame, her terrified wide eyes, and the plastic trash can she was clutching like a life preserver. He looked at the heavy steel coffee urn resting dented on the floor. He didn't offer his hand to help her up. He didn't thank her. He just stared at her, the exhaustion in his face replaced by a sudden terrifying clarity. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like a lock he was trying to pick. "What?" Dominic asked, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the ringing silence of the room. "Is your name?" Sadie swallowed the bile in her mouth. She clutched her burned hand to her chest. "Sadie," she choked out. Dominic nodded slowly. He reached into his suit jacket. Sadie flinched, bracing for the gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick, folded stack of $100 bills. He didn't count them. He just dropped the heavy wad of cash into the lap of her wet apron. "Go home, Sadie," he said softly. He turned away from her, gesturing to his bleeding bodyguard. "Wipe down the cameras. Call the cleaners. We leave in 2 minutes." Sadie sat on the floor, the smell of copper in her nose, staring at more money than she had made in 2 years of double shifts. Her hand burned. The floor was sticky. The mob didn't do favors. The mob did debts. And as she looked at the giant bleeding out on the floor, she realized with a cold, sinking dread that she hadn't just saved Dominic Russo's life. She had just made him owe her one. The crash didn't happen in the restaurant. It happened exactly 42 minutes later on the sagging mattress of her 4th-floor walk-up in the South Ward. Adrenaline leaving the human body feels a lot like a sudden, violent flu. Sadie's teeth were chattering so hard they ached. Her knees knocked together as she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the scarred linoleum floor. She hadn't bothered to turn on the overhead light. The neon sign from the 24-hour liquor store across the street bled through the cheap plastic blinds, painting the room in sickly, intermittent strokes of pink and buzzing blue. She peeled the wet, cold uniform off her skin. It smelled like rancid, grease-wet dog and the metallic tang of blood. She shoved it into a black garbage bag and tied the plastic in a vicious, tight knot, as if she could suffocate the memory inside it. Then there was the money. The stack of hundreds sat on her chipped laminate nightstand. It was thick, disgustingly thick. Sadie picked it up with her left hand, her right hand wrapped in a clumsy layer of damp paper towels, and masking tape pulsed with a hot, steady heartbeat of its own. She held the cash to her nose. It didn't smell like salvation. It smelled dirty. It smelled like old leather sweat and a faint, powdery chemical scent that made her stomach churn. 52. She had counted it twice on the subway ride home, her hands shaking so badly she kept dropping the crisp bills onto the grimy floor of the train car. $5,200. Rent was $800. Electricity was $50. Groceries were $80. She could pay off her credit card. She could fix the radiator that clanked like a dying engine all winter. She could sleep for a week. Instead, she shoved the money into a worn-out sneaker at the bottom of her closet. She pushed the sneaker behind a pile of winter sweaters. It felt radioactive. Sadie stumbled into her tiny bathroom. The mirror over the sink was speckled with hard water stains. She looked at herself. Her brown hair was plastered to her skull, matted with sweat and rain. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out, surrounded by bruised purple exhaustion. There was a smear of dried brown across her left cheekbone. She scrubbed at it with a wet washcloth until the skin was raw and pink. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the water damage on the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building. A domestic dispute on the 2nd floor. The rattling hum of the refrigerator. Every time a car drove past outside, the headlights swept across her ceiling and her breath caught in her throat. She expected the heavy thud of boots on the stairs. She expected the door to splinter inward. She expected Dominic Russo to realize he had made a mistake, that loose ends in his world weren't paid off. They were cut. When the sun finally rose, casting a grey, dirty light over the city, Sadie felt worse than she had the night before. Her hand was stiff, the skin across her knuckles, a tight, angry red that bubbled at the center. She needed burn cream. She needed coffee, and she needed to figure out if she was a fugitive. She turned on the small, boxy television, resting on a milk crate in the corner of the room. The local morning news anchor was droning on about traffic on the I-95. Sadie waited. She watched through the weather through a segment on a local dog shelter, through a commercial for a personal injury lawyer. Nothing. There was no mention of a shootout at Lombardi's. No mention of a 7-foot giant with his skull caved in. No mention of bodyguards bleeding out over expensive steaks. The silence was heavier than the violence. It meant the police weren't investigating. It meant Dominic Russo owned the people who cleaned up the mess, and he owned the people who wrote the news. Sadie put on an oversized grey hoodie, shoved her burned hand into the front pocket, and locked her door. She twisted the deadbolt, pulled the handle twice to make sure it was secure, and headed down the stairs. The air outside was damp and cold, carrying the sharp scent of ozone from last night's storm. She walked 3 blocks to the corner pharmacy. The paranoia was a physical weight pressing down on the back of her neck. Every person in a dark coat, every idling car made her heart stutter. She wasn't a hero, she was a waitress, and she had somehow stepped onto the chessboard of a war she didn't understand. The pharmacy smelled like sterile, cotton-cheap lavender detergent and dust. The fluorescent lights hummed with a high-pitched, anxiety-inducing frequency. Sadie stood in aisle 4, staring blankly at a wall of first-aid supplies. Her brain was sluggish, struggling to decipher the neon-colored boxes of hydrocortisone triple antibiotic ointments and lidocaine sprays. Her right hand was throbbing so fiercely she could feel it in her elbow. She kept it buried deep in the pocket of her hoodie. She reached out with her left hand and grabbed a generic tube of burn gel and a roll of gauze. She turned to head toward the register. A man was standing at the end of the aisle. Sadie stopped dead. Her sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished linoleum. He hadn't been there 5 seconds ago. He wasn't browsing. He was standing perfectly still, his hands resting casually in the pockets of a tailored, navy blue wool peacoat. He was younger than the men at the restaurant, maybe 25, with sharp cheekbones and dark, perfectly styled hair. He looked like an investment banker, but his eyes were entirely still. Predator eyes. He looked at her. He didn't smile, but his chin dipped a fraction of an inch in acknowledgement. Sadie's flight response kicked in. She spun around to go down the opposite end of the aisle. A second man was blocking it. This one was older, wider. He wore a cheap leather jacket that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and motor oil. He had a thick, broken nose and was casually examining a box of unflavored dental floss. They had her boxed in between the Band-Aids and the feminine hygiene products. Sadie's breathing went shallow. She clutched the tube of burn gel so tightly the plastic crimped. "Don't run," she told herself. "There's nowhere to run." The younger man in the peacoat walked down the aisle toward her. His footsteps made absolutely no sound. He stopped 2 feet away, invading her personal space just enough to establish dominance without making a scene. Up close, she could smell his cologne. Cedar and black pepper. Expensive. "Sadie," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was smooth, polished to a dangerous sheen. Sadie didn't answer. She pressed her back against the metal shelving. A box of gauze pads tumbled off a shelf and hit the floor. The man glanced down at the box, then back up to her face. His gaze drifted down to the pocket of her hoodie, where she was hiding her hand. "Mr. Russo sent me," the man said quietly. "My name is Leo." "I don't know anything," Sadie blurted out, her voice cracking. It was a pathetic, panicky sound. "I didn't see anything. I went home. I went straight home." Leo's expression didn't change. "We know exactly where you went. We know you haven't spoken to the police. The police don't need to be involved in a gas line explosion at a local restaurant. Unfortunate accident. Closed for renovations." He reached into his coat pocket. Sadie flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. "This is it. Right here in aisle 4, a soft rustle of paper." Sadie opened her eyes. Leo was holding out a small, heavy white jar with a simple pharmaceutical label. Silver sulfadiazine, Leo said, offering it to her. Prescription grade. It prevents infection and promotes tissue healing much faster than that over-the-counter garbage you're holding. Apply it twice a day. Keep the wound wrapped, but let it breathe at night. Sadie stared at the jar. She didn't take it. Take it, Sadie, Leo said softly. The smoothness in his voice dropped, revealing a razor-sharp edge underneath. Mr. Russo insists. Trembling, Sadie pulled her left hand from her side and took the jar. It was cool to the touch. Why? She whispered. Leo tilted his head. Mr. Russo protects his investments. You performed a service. You were compensated. But a burn left untreated can fester. It can cause complications. Complications draw attention. Attention is bad for business. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. The oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly. Your shifts at Lombardi's have been covered indefinitely with full pay, Leo added, turning away. Take a few days. Rest. Do not leave the city. He paused at the end of the aisle, looking back over his shoulder. And Sadie, she swallowed hard. Yes, don't put the money in a shoe, Leo said mildly. It's cliché. A safety deposit box at First National is much more secure. Have a good morning. He walked away. A second later, the older man in the leather jacket dropped the dental floss back onto the shelf and followed him. Sadie stood frozen in the empty aisle, the fluorescent lights humming above her. She looked down at the prescription burn cream in her hand. Her chest heaved. They had been in her apartment. They had watched her sleep. They had found the money. She wasn't a loose end to be cut. She was a pet on a very, very short leash. 3 days passed. The city moved on. Sadie did exactly what she was told. She stayed in her apartment. She applied the silver sulfadiazine cream. The angry red blisters on her hand began to dry out, flaking away to reveal raw, tender pink skin beneath. The pain dulled to a manageable, persistent itch. She didn't touch the money in the shoe. She couldn't bring herself to move it to a bank. Using it felt like signing a contract in blood. But the reality of her bank account was a hard, unforgiving math. Her landlord slid a final notice under her door on Thursday morning. She had to make a choice, starve on her principles or survive on mob cash. She chose survival. She always did. On Friday afternoon, she pulled a single $100 bill from the stack. She walked down to a check cashing place 3 blocks over a place with bulletproof glass and an exorbitant exchange rate, and broke the bill. She bought groceries. She bought a coffee. She walked back to her apartment, feeling dirty but full. As she rounded the corner onto her street, she saw it. A sleek, black Lincoln Town car was parked directly in front of her building. It was illegally parked by a fire hydrant. A parking enforcement officer was walking down the street, writing tickets. But when he saw the town car, he looked away and crossed to the other side of the avenue. Sadie's heart dropped into her stomach. The rear passenger door opened. Leo stepped out onto the damp pavement. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit today, looking even more out of place against the backdrop of peeling brick and overflowing trash cans. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, then gestured to the open door of the car. Sadie clutched her plastic grocery bags. She could run. She could drop the cheap bread and canned soup and sprint down the alleyway. But she remembered the man in the pharmacy. She remembered the silence of the news reports. Running was just an invitation for a hunt. She walked slowly toward the car. Her legs felt like they were moving through deep water. Leo took the grocery bags from her hands, placing them carefully in the trunk. He held the rear door open. Sadie slid into the back seat. The interior of the car smelled like expensive leather ozone and faint cigar smoke. It was dead quiet. The thick glass completely muted the sounds of the city outside. Leo got into the driver's seat. He didn't ask her where she wanted to go. He just put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. They drove for 20 minutes, leaving the rundown South Ward and crossing over the river into the garment district. The streets here were narrower lined with old brick-faced warehouses and heavy iron fire escapes. The car pulled up to a storefront with blacked-out windows. Above the door, a faded hand-painted sign read, "Moretti & Sons. Bespoke Tailoring." Leo opened her door. "Inside, the back room." Sadie stepped out onto the curb. Her mouth was dry. She walked toward the heavy oak door and pushed it open. A bell jingled above her head, an incongruous, cheerful sound. The front of the shop was legitimate. Racks of half-finished suit jackets hung from brass rails. Bolts of dark wool and silk were stacked on large wooden cutting tables. The air was thick with the smell of hot steam-scorched cotton and chalk dust. The heavy, thumping hiss of an industrial steam press echoed from somewhere out of sight. There was no one at the front counter. Sadie walked slowly down the narrow aisle between the cutting tables, her sneakers silent on the worn wooden floorboards. She reached a heavy velvet curtain at the back of the shop. She pushed it aside. The back room was vast, brightly lit by large frosted skylights. It looked less like a tailor shop and more like a private lounge. Leather armchairs, a mahogany wet bar, and a large antique billiards table dominated the space. Dominic Russo was standing by a massive three-way mirror. He was in his shirt sleeves, his arms held slightly out to his sides. An elderly man with a measuring tape draped around his neck was pinning the fabric of a new charcoal waistcoat across Dominic's broad chest. Dominic looked different in the daylight. The harsh exhaustion she had seen at the restaurant was gone, replaced by a cold, coiled energy. He was dangerous. It radiated off him not in explosive bursts, but in a low, heavy hum. He caught her reflection in the mirror. He raised a hand, stopping the elderly tailor. "Arthur, that will be all for today. Leave us." The old man nodded quickly, gathering his pins and scurried past Sadie through the velvet curtain without making eye contact. Sadie and Dominic were alone. Dominic slowly turned to face her. He didn't speak immediately. He took his time looking at her, his dark eyes cataloguing her cheap jeans, her oversized hoodie, the rigid way she held her shoulders, and the raw pink skin of her right hand hanging out of her sleeve. He walked over to the wet bar. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer her one. "You spent the money," Dominic said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble in the large room. Sadie flinched. "I bought groceries. I was hungry." Dominic took a sip of his drink. He leaned against the mahogany bar, crossing his ankles. "I didn't ask for a justification. I stated a fact. You spent the money. That means you accepted the transaction." "I didn't have a choice," Sadie said, her voice shaking, but a tiny spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "You put it in my apron. Your men broke into my apartment." "My men secured your apartment," Dominic corrected smoothly. "To ensure the people who hired the man you killed didn't decide to tie up loose ends. You are alive right now because I willed it." Sadie stared at him. The sheer arrogance of it made her stomach twist. "I'm alive because I threw a coffee pot." Dominic paused. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was a break in the stone facade. "You threw a 30-pound urn of boiling water at a professional killer who had just dispatched 2 of my best men," Dominic said softly, setting his glass down. He took a slow step toward her. "You broke his patella. You shattered his orbital bone on a hostess stand. It was violent, it was messy, and it was entirely improvised." He stopped 2 feet in front of her. He was taller than she remembered. She had to tilt her head up to look him in the eye. "I owe you my life, Sadie," he said. The words sounded like they tasted like ash in his mouth. "A Russo does not live with unsettled debts." "I don't want anything," Sadie whispered, backing up a half step. "I just want to go back to my job." "Your job is gone," Dominic stated flatly. "The girl who worked at Lombardi's died the moment that man walked through the door. You are a civilian who killed an enforcer for the Vitiello Syndicate. If they find out who you are, they will skin you alive just to send a message." Sadie stopped breathing. The floor tilted slightly beneath her feet. Dominic reached out. His large, calloused hand gently caught her left elbow, steadying her. His grip was firm, surprisingly warm. "You belong to me now," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Not as a prisoner, as an employee. You work for me. I keep you hidden. I keep you fed, and I keep you breathing. Do you understand?" Sadie looked up into his flat, muddy brown eyes. She saw the absolute certainty there. There was no negotiation. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of the world she had just fallen into. "What kind of work?" she asked, her voice hollow. Dominic released her elbow. He turned back toward his glass on the bar. "You proved you can think under pressure, Sadie," he said, taking a slow sip. "You're going to clean up my messes." The cleanup didn't mean bodies. It meant paper. Sadie's new office was a windowless room beneath a commercial laundromat in the East End. The air down there tasted heavily of industrial detergent, hot lint, and old brick. The constant rhythmic thud of the washing machines above made the single fluorescent bulb overhead vibrate, casting a jittery, seasick light across the metal desk. Dominic hadn't handed her a gun. He had handed her 3 cardboard boxes of burner phones, a commercial cross-cut shredder, and a stack of ledger books bound in cheap faux leather. "The men who work for me know how to pull a trigger," Dominic had said, leaving her at the door on her first day. "They don't know how to balance a column without leaving a digital footprint. You passed high school calculus. You understand poverty. You know how to make numbers disappear." So she became a ghost in the machine. For 3 weeks, Sadie sat under the vibrating light. Her burned right hand, now healed into a tight, shiny pink scar across her knuckles, learned to flick open cheap plastic cell phones. She extracted SIM cards, snapped them in half with needle-nose pliers, and dropped the plastic shards into a coffee can half filled with bleach. The smell of the chlorine burned her nasal passages, a sharp chemical counterpoint to the heavy humidity of the laundromat. She cross-referenced cash drops from the docks against the payroll of Dominic's legitimate construction fronts. She found discrepancies. She found skimming. She didn't report it to the capos. She wrote it on a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper, folded it twice, and handed it directly to Leo when he came to collect her at 11 p.m. every night. She never saw what happened to the men who skimmed. She just noticed that the handwriting on the doc reports changed the following week. It was exhausting, tedious work. Her fingers were permanently stained with cheap printer ink, and the skin around her nails was chewed raw from anxiety. But the rent was paid, the refrigerator was full, and nobody knocked on her door at night. On a rainy Thursday, the heavy steel door to the basement groaned open. Sadie didn't look up from the ledger. She assumed it was Leo bringing her the afternoon coffee. He silently supplied black 2 sugars, always lukewarm. But the footsteps were too heavy. She raised her head. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, the shoulders dusted with fine droplets of rain. He looked terrible. The muddy brown of his eyes was bloodshot, and the rigid, perfect posture that usually defined him was slumping by a fraction of an inch. He smelled like wet asphalt, stale cigarette smoke, and the distinct coppery tang of dried blood. He didn't look at her. He walked to the corner of the small room, pulled out a rusted folding chair, and sat down heavily. The metal joints shrieked under his weight. He leaned his head back against the concrete wall and closed his eyes. Sadie sat perfectly still. The hum of the washing machines above seemed deafening. She watched him breathe. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals. There was a dark smear across the cuff of his white shirt, peeking out from the sleeve of his coat. It wasn't his blood. "Keep working." Dominic grated out, his eyes still closed. "The sound of the shredder. Turn it on." Sadie blinked. She reached out and flipped the switch on the heavy industrial shredder sitting next to her desk. The machine roared to life, a loud, grinding, mechanical whine that devoured the silence in the room. Dominic's shoulders dropped slightly. The tension in his jaw relaxed. He wasn't here to check on her. He was here to hide. The realization hit Sadie with the force of a physical blow. Dominic Russo, the man who owned the streets, who dictated life and death in the back booths of restaurants, had nowhere else to go. His penthouse was probably full of guards. His clubs were full of enemies. The only place he could sit in a room covered in someone else's blood and just breathe was in a windowless basement with a 22-year-old waitress who owed him her life. Sadie picked up a stack of old invoices. She fed them into the shredder. The blades caught the thick paper, tearing it into confetti with a violent, satisfying crunch. She fed another stack, then another. They sat like that for 40 minutes. The king of the city hiding in the dark, and the girl with the burned hand feeding paper to a machine just to give him noise. When Dominic finally stood up, the vulnerability was gone. His posture was rigid again. The mask was back in place. He stopped at her desk on his way out. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small, flat, velvet box on top of her ledger. "Your hand," he said smoothly. "The scar tissue. It catches the light. People look at it." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked up the concrete stairs, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him. Sadie stared at the box. She reached out her fingers, brushing the velvet. She opened it. Inside was a pair of thin, supple black leather gloves. The leather was buttery soft, the stitching flawless. They were custom-made. They would hide the burn perfectly. She picked one up and slid it onto her right hand. It fit like a second skin. It felt warm. It felt like a brand. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday. Sadie was out of the basement. Leo had driven her to a commercial meatpacking facility on the edge of the river, one of Dominic's older fronts. She was supposed to audit 3 months of backlogged inventory manifests. The office was suspended above the cutting floor, enclosed in thick, soundproof glass. Below, men in heavy coats and hard hats moved massive swinging carcasses of beef along overhead metal rails. The air conditioning in the office was broken, but the ambient cold from the refrigerated floor below seeped up through the floorboards, chilling Sadie's ankles. It was 9:15 p.m. The night shift was just clocking in. Sadie was highlighting a discrepancy in a shipment of imported prosciutto when the lights on the cutting floor abruptly went out. The heavy mechanical hum of the refrigeration units died. Total darkness below, total silence. Sadie's highlighter stopped moving. The hairs on her arms stood up. She looked through the glass window down at the floor. It was a pitch-black void. Then she heard the sound. Poof! Thwack! It was the exact same sound she had heard at Lombardi's. The misfiring staple gun. A suppressed weapon. Below her, the emergency backup lights flickered on, bathing the cutting floor in a sickly, jaundiced yellow glow. 3 men in tactical gear were moving fluidly through the swinging sides of beef. They weren't Dominic's men. They moved with military precision, their rifles raised, sweeping the area. On the floor near the loading dock, 2 of the night shift butchers lay motionless, dark pools, spreading quickly across the white tile. The Vitiello Syndicate. They had found the front. Sadie's breath caught in her throat. The panic, the cold, wet terror from the restaurant flooded back into her veins. Her knees buckled, and she dropped below the sightline of the glass window, hitting the cheap carpet of the office floor hard. She crawled under the heavy wooden desk. She curled herself into a tight ball, her knees pressed to her chest, her gloved hands clamped firmly over her own mouth to trap the sound of her hyperventilation. Footsteps clanged on the metal stairs leading up to the office. Heavy. Fast. Someone kicked the office door. The wood splintered, but the lock held. Another kick. The frame cracked. Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. She tasted copper. She had bitten her own inner lip so hard it was bleeding. A third kick shattered the door inward. It slammed against the wall. Heavy boots crunched on the carpet. The smell of ozone, cold air, and gun oil filled the small room. "Clear the files," a rough voice ordered. "Pour the accelerant. We burn it." A liquid splashed across the linoleum near the door. It smelled sharply of gasoline. Sadie pressed herself further back into the shadows under the desk, her heart vibrating so violently it physically hurt her ribs. If she stayed, she burned. If she moved, she took a bullet. Suddenly a deafening roar erupted from the cutting floor below. Not a suppressed shot, an unsuppressed heavy-caliber bark. Boom, boom, boom. The man standing in the office jerked toward the window. What the? A bullet shattered the glass of the office window from the outside, ripping through the man's chest. He collapsed backward, hitting the filing cabinet with a heavy thud, his rifle clattering to the floor, just inches from Sadie's hiding spot under the desk. The gunfire below turned into a chaotic, echoing war zone. The sharp cracks of rifles answered by the booming, rhythmic thuds of heavy handguns. Men were shouting. Meat was being torn apart by stray bullets. Sadie didn't move. The smell of the gasoline was overpowering now, mixing with the sudden, sharp scent of ruptured bowels from the dead man lying near her feet. Her stomach heaved, but she swallowed the bile down. 10 minutes passed, or maybe 10 hours. Time stopped functioning. The gunfire slowed, then it ceased entirely. The silence that followed was heavier, more terrifying than the noise. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunched on the broken glass covering the office floor. They stopped right in front of the desk. Sadie stopped breathing entirely. She waited for the barrel of a gun to peer under the mahogany lip. "Sadie." The voice was rough, out of breath, and coated in gravel. Sadie slowly lowered her hands from her mouth. She crept forward, inching her head out from under the desk. Dominic stood there. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a dark tactical vest over a black sweater. His face was smeared with grease and something dark and wet. He held a heavy smoking pistol in his right hand. He looked down at her. His chest was heaving. For the first time since she had met him, his flat brown eyes were wide, the pupils blown out with pure adrenaline. He didn't look at the dead man on the floor. He looked at her. He saw her curled up like a terrified animal, trembling violently, the black leather gloves covering her hands. He dropped his gun. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. He dropped to his knees right in front of the desk, completely ignoring the broken glass. He reached under, grabbed her by the shoulders, and hauled her out from under the wood. His grip was bruising, almost violent. He pulled her against his chest. Sadie stiffened. The tactical vest was hard and smelled like burnt gunpowder, but underneath it she could feel the frantic, heavy pounding of his heart. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp, right next to her ear. His large hands moved quickly over her arms, her back checking for blood. "Sadie, tell me if you are hit." "No," she choked out, her voice a pathetic squeak. "No, I'm okay." I hid. Dominic let out a long, ragged exhale. His hand stopped moving, resting heavily on her shoulders. He didn't let her go. He just held her there, kneeling in the gasoline, and the glass surrounded by the ruin of his empire. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was the desperate, crushing grip of a man clinging to the one thing in his world that wasn't trying to kill him. They tracked Leo's car. Dominic muttered more to himself than to her. He pulled back slightly, looking her in the eye. "I'm getting you out of here." He stood up, pulling her to her feet with one hand. He picked up his gun. "Walk behind me," he ordered. "Keep your eyes on my back. Do not look at the floor." She followed him out of the office and down the metal stairs. She tried to obey. She tried to look only at the broad expanse of his black sweater. But as they crossed the yellow-lit cutting floor, the smell hit her raw meat, hot blood, and emptied casings. She saw the bodies in her peripheral vision. 7 of them, slumped against the stainless steel tables draped over the conveyor belts. She focused on Dominic's back. He was the monster who had brought her here. He was the monster pulling her out. And in the dark, cold math of survival, she realized she didn't care which one he was, as long as he kept walking. The penthouse was silent. It was a sprawling, sterile expanse of white marble glass and dark oak. It felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude observation deck. Sadie sat on the edge of a massive leather sofa in the center of the living room. It was 3 a.m. Dominic sat in a low armchair opposite her. He had taken the tactical vest off, discarding it on the pristine floor. His black sweater was pulled up, revealing a torso, mapped with old, pale scars. Knife wounds, bullet puckers, the physical ledger of his rise to power. There was a new entry. A bullet had grazed his left side just below the ribs. It hadn't penetrated the muscle deeply, but it had torn a jagged, ugly furrow through the skin. It was bleeding sluggishly, a dark red trail, tracking down toward his waistband. Leo was dead. They had found him in the alley behind the meatpacking plant, shot twice in the back of the head. Dominic had dispatched the rest of his security detail to the perimeter of the building. He refused to call a doctor. The Vitiellos have ears in the underground clinics. Dominic had grunted, throwing a first aid kit onto the glass coffee table. You clean it, you stitch it. Sadie had stared at him. I pour coffee, Dominic. I do math. I don't sew skin. You'll learn, he replied, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. Now her black leather gloves were resting on the table. Her bare hands, the right one, sporting its shiny pink scar, was slick with rubbing alcohol. She soaked a cotton pad in iodine and pressed it into the furrow on his side. Dominic's entire body went rigid. The muscles in his abdomen corded like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. He didn't even open his eyes. I'm sorry, Sadie muttered, her hands shaking slightly. Don't apologize for necessary pain, Dominic said, his voice strained. Just finish it. She threaded the curved surgical needle with thick, black nylon thread. Her stomach rolled at the thought of pushing metal through human flesh, but the mechanical detachment she had learned in the basement took over. She pinched the edges of the jagged wound together. She pushed the needle through. Dominic's breath hissed sharply through his teeth. His hand reached out blindly and gripped the edge of the glass coffee table so hard his knuckles turned white. Why did you come for me? Sadie asked. Her voice was quiet in the massive, echoing room. She pulled the thread tight, tying a clumsy but tight surgical knot. At the plant, Dominic opened his eyes. He watched her hands work. You are my employee. I protect what is mine. Sadie pushed the needle through a second time. She didn't look up from his ribs. I balance your ledgers, Dominic. I shred your burner phones. You could hire a dozen accountants tomorrow who wouldn't flinch at gunfire. She tied the second knot, cutting the thread with small medical scissors. You didn't come to the plant to save an accountant? Dominic was silent for a long time. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city traffic, 40 stories below. You didn't look at me, he finally said. Sadie paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She looked up at his face. What? At the restaurant, Dominic said softly. His eyes were heavy, the adrenaline crash finally pulling him down. Before the giant, when the skillet slipped, and you burned your hand. You didn't look at me with terror. You didn't look at me with greed. You just looked at me like a man who was in the way of your job. He shifted slightly, wincing as the skin pulled against the new stitches. Everyone else in this city either wants to kill me or they want me to kill someone for them. Every single person. He reached out. His large, blood-stained hand gently grasped her wrist. He didn't pull her closer. He just held her. Except you. You just wanted to go home. Sadie stared at the hand wrapped around her wrist. The warmth of his skin bled through the chill of the air conditioning. You owe me a debt, Dominic murmured. That's what I told you. That's how my world works. Debts and payments. And when is the debt paid? Sadie asked, her voice cracking slightly. She didn't pull her arm away. Dominic's thumb slowly brushed over the pink scar tissue on her knuckles. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark, terrifying contrast to the violence she had watched him inflict hours ago. "Never," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. The debt was a lie, Sadie. It was the only way I knew how to keep you in the room. He looked her dead in the eye. The muddy brown was stripped of all pretense, all mob posturing. He was a man drowning in an ocean of blood, holding on to a 22-year-old girl like a piece of driftwood. "If I let you go," he whispered, "I am entirely in the dark." Sadie looked at him. She looked at the blood on her hands, the medical kit on the table, the pristine, cold walls of the cage he had built for both of them. She could run. Tomorrow, when the sun came up, she could take the money from the shoe walk to the bus station and disappear. She could go back to serving cheap steaks and surviving on tips, but she looked at the exhaustion in his face. She felt the heavy, quiet weight of his hand on hers. The grease fire of her old life was gone. She had stepped into a colder, sharper fire, and she realized with a cynical hollow ache in her chest that it was already too late to walk away. She didn't want to. "Hold still," Sadie said quietly. She pulled her wrist from his grasp. She picked up the needle, pinched the torn flesh of the monster who owned the city, and began to sew him back together. If you want to dive deeper into the dark, tangled web of Sadie and Dominic's survival, hit that like button, share this video, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Would you have stitched him up or taken the chance to run? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned, because the war with the Vitiello Syndicate is just beginning, and Sadie's ledger is about to get a lot bloodier. Don't miss the next chapter of this gritty mafia romance.